Hi there, I'm Seb Maley, and in this video we'll take a look at yet another recent IR35 case that has reached a tax tribunal. This case is the latest in a long line of high-profile investigations focusing on TV personalities and involved the Sky Sports presenter Dave Clark, who for many years hosted coverage of darts for Sky. The period HMRC were focusing on was from 2013 to 2018, so long before the implementation of the off-payroll reform in the private sector, meaning it is Mr. Clark who holds the liability. Before offsetting tax already paid, this liability is a fairly substantial £281,000. Having gone through the normal process of an IR35 inquiry, it was HMRC's view that Mr. Clark was a disguised employee of Sky for the period in question, and they raised an assessment for the liability, which Mr. Clark then appealed. This then takes the case to a First Tier Tax Tribunal, which means that a judge analyses the case and decides whether HMRC are correct or not. Now, it should be fairly obvious that this type of case involving a front-of-camera presenter is pretty unique and atypical of the thousands of contractors who are also affected by the legislation. But all the IR35 case law that contractors know and love was still used and analysed by the judge. Mr. Clark argued that he had a right of substitution and had actually recommended a substitute to Sky when he was unavailable for presenting work. But the reality, which HMRC put forward and the judge agreed with, was that this substitute was actually engaged and paid directly by Sky. For substitution to be genuine, the engagement between the client and the original contractor must remain in place, and it's the original contractor who should pay the substitute through a lower level agreement. Mr. Clark's arguments also covered control. He said he had control over the content of his broadcasts, and none of what he did, whether it was presenting to the camera or interviewing guests, was scripted by anyone else. The judge agreed with HMRC, however, that the executive producer was in control on the day and that Mr. Clark worked within an overarching framework of regulatory and editorial control. The judge also considered the argument that Mr. Clark would only be paid for work he had actually carried out, and there were clauses in the contract which suggested this was the case. It became apparent, though, that Mr. Clark had received consistent monthly payments throughout his engagement with Sky, regardless of the amount of presenting jobs he had done. So ultimately, the judge sided with HMRC and agreed that Mr. Clark was caught by IR35. He could appeal the result and take the case to an upper tribunal, but I would say that given the findings of the First Tier Tribunal, the prospects of success are fairly slim. So what are the takeaways from this case? Well, as I mentioned, it isn't particularly typical, so I don't think either contractors or engagers should get too spooked by the result. It's a reminder of that retrospective risk, which is still an issue for contractors. So despite the fact that responsibility shifted to engagers this year, it's important to still consider any historic engagements prior to the 6th of April 2021. And the main takeaway is really the fact that a lot of Mr. Clark's arguments were pointing to the written contract, but when HMRC probed the reality of what actually happened, they found a very different set of circumstances. We will, of course, keep you up to date with any developments in this case, as well as any others. Please subscribe to our channel for more video content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.